She stood still, sunlight brushing her shoulders, while 6 armed officers raised their weapons, until 2 silent shadows emerged behind her, and everything changed. At 38, Danielle Moore had found peace in the quiet hills of rural South Carolina. A decorated Marine Special Operations veteran, she lived on a modest 5-acre farm surrounded by pine trees and silence. But on that particular Tuesday morning, the calm shattered like glass. Without warning, 6 police cruisers screeched to a stop outside her property. Red and blue lights pulsed against the morning sun as armed officers stepped out, forming a perimeter around her land. Danielle stood still, dirt from her tomato patch still on her gloves, trying to keep her breath steady. These officers didn't come to ask questions. They came looking for a confrontation. Unbeknownst to them, Danielle wasn't alone. Inside her modest farmhouse, 2 Belgian Malinois Ranger and Echo lay, in silence waiting. These weren't ordinary dogs. They were military-trained canines who had once moved through Afghan deserts by Danielle's side, capable of detecting explosives, neutralizing threats, and obeying commands in 5 languages. With a subtle press of a button on her smartwatch, Danielle sent them a silent signal hold. The lead officer, Captain Mark Renshaw, approached with a sneer. No warrant, no explanation, just vague claims of suspicious activity. Danielle's expression didn't flinch. She had seen worse in Kabul, but being surrounded in her own country for simply living while black cut deeper. And soon the very dogs trained to serve abroad would remind these officers that they had underestimated the wrong woman on the wrong day. The gravel crunched beneath Captain Renshaw's boots as he stopped 10 feet from Danielle Moore, resting one hand on his holstered sidearm. "We've received reports of suspicious activity on your property," he said, eyes scanning the farmhouse and barn like a man already convinced of guilt. Danielle straightened her posture, slowly brushing a fleck of soil from her shirt, her military bearing unconsciously slipping into place. She kept her voice calm, even. "Then I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, Captain. But unless you have a warrant, I must ask that you stay off my land." His expression darkened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a black woman who clearly knew the law better than he'd anticipated. Behind him, the other 5 officers shifted uneasily, spreading into a semicircle to cut off any exit. To them, this wasn't an inquiry, it was an operation. Danielle's heart pounded beneath her ribs, but her breathing remained steady. Afghanistan had taught her how to handle armed men with itchy fingers. This wasn't fear. This was assessment. Her dogs, Ranger and Echo, remained inside the house, perfectly still, watching, through reinforced windows, trained to act only when called. She had raised them from pups, molded them with the same discipline the Corps had instilled in her. They were her shield, her backup, her living legacy from a life of service that still haunted her sleep. "I'm not aware of any emergency," she said, her tone clipped military. "And unless you can produce specific evidence of a crime in progress, you're trespassing." Captain Renshaw's thin smile disappeared completely. "We don't need a warrant when we have probable cause," he snapped. "Neighbors say people have been coming and going at all hours. We've got reason to believe there's illicit activity happening here." Danielle blinked once, slowly. The only visitors to her farm in the last month had been her veterinarian and a fellow veteran who brought her fresh bread every Sunday after church. Both white. Both familiar faces in town. This wasn't about suspicious traffic. It was harassment, plain, targeted, deliberate. Renshaw took a step forward. "You hiding something, Ms. Moore?" Her fists curled slowly at her sides, not in anger, but in discipline. "You know better than to ask that without cause," she said. "You also know what the Constitution says about unlawful search and seizure." The moment the words left her mouth, he signaled his men. "Let's take a look around. She might be hiding something worth finding." 2 officers peeled off toward her barn. Another veered toward her tool shed. Danielle's voice rang out clear and commanding. "I do not consent to a search of my property." They ignored her. One kicked over a crate of fresh tomatoes shed just harvested red fruit bursting on impact like blood spatter on gravel. Another ripped open the door to her shed, rummaging through tools and containers. The violence wasn't random, it was calculated, designed to provoke. A young officer standing to the rear. Officer Bennett, his name tag red, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He shifted from foot to foot, watching the other's lips pressed into a tight line. He couldn't have been more than 25, new to the job, and still unaware that silence could make him complicit. Danielle didn't waste time. She reached into her jeans pocket, fingers closing around a small recording device she always carried when venturing into town. She clicked it on. Then, without taking her eyes off Renshaw, she pressed another button, one tucked under her wristwatch strap. Her internal security system blinked to life, sending a silent signal to a secure server. Cameras across her property now began recording from multiple angles, footage auto-uploading to the cloud, and to her emergency contact, her attorney. Then Renshaw did something that set her pulse spiking. He stepped in close, invading her space like he was back in the 60s, not the 21st century. "You think wearing a uniform makes you special?" he muttered, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Doesn't change what you are." She stared into his pale blue eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away. She remembered what her grandfather, also a Marine, had once told her. "They'll try to get under your skin. Don't let them. They want your anger. It justifies their fear." She didn't flinch. "That uniform gave me the right to defend the Constitution, something you're violating right now." Behind them, one of the officers called out, "Nothing in the barn, Cap." Renshaw didn't break eye contact. "Check the house next." Danielle's blood ran cold. She took a single step forward and blocked the footpath up to her porch. "You are not entering my home without a warrant." His hand moved to unclip his holster. "Are you threatening an officer, Ms. Moore?" "I'm reminding you of your legal boundaries," she replied. Voice steel. "You cross that line, and this becomes a federal issue." A tense silence fell over the farm. Her dogs hadn't moved, but they were listening, watching, waiting. And if Renshaw so much as reached for his gun, they would move, fast. The next few seconds would determine everything. The moment Captain Renshaw ordered his men to search Danielle's home, the temperature on the farm seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The quiet countryside air, once filled with birdsong and wind rustling through pine needles, now hung thick with threat. Danielle didn't move. Her boots stayed planted on the gravel path like the roots of an old tree, unshaken, unwavering. She locked eyes with the two officers climbing her porch steps, their hands grazing their sidearms, pretending they had every right to invade. "This stops now," she said, her voice ringing like a bell across the still morning air. "You have no legal right to enter my home, and you know it. This is a constitutional violation." Renshaw scoffed, the sneer curling back onto his lips. "Last warning." "Ms. Moore," he said, unfastening the snap on his holster, "step aside or be arrested for obstruction, or be—" Danielle's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. She had been in worse standoffs in war-torn provinces. She'd negotiated with warlords and had bullets whistle past her ear. But what made this moment burn deeper was its location, her home, her land, and her fellow Americans turning into aggressors. This wasn't just a breach of her rights. It was a desecration of the very freedoms she'd once fought to protect. She squared her shoulders and stood firm. That's when Officer Bennett shifted. His hesitation now read more like distress, and Danielle noticed the subtle flicker of motion, his hand reaching for his phone. Renshaw caught it too. "Did I ask for your opinion, Bennett?" he barked, fire flashing in his eyes. Bennett froze. Lips pressed into a grim line. Danielle recognized the young man's internal battle, the one between duty and conscience. She'd seen it before in green recruits on the battlefield. Sometimes they folded. Sometimes they became heroes. Bennett didn't speak, but his discomfort was now visible to everyone. Renshaw returned his glare to Danielle. "Let me spell it out for you. We're going to search that house. And if you resist, we'll have no choice but to take you in. Make one wrong move, and it's obstruction or worse." His words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Danielle could feel every officer's posture shift. Tactical positioning. They were closing in, expecting a reaction, hoping for one. She didn't give it to them. "I served this country for 15 years, she said, addressing all 6 officers now. "I upheld the Constitution overseas, and I expect the same respect for it here. What you're doing is illegal." Renshaw laughed, a hollow sound devoid of any humor. "There you go, playing the veteran card. You people always think that uniform makes you equal." He paused. The last word sat on his tongue like a match waiting to be struck. "Another what?" Captain Danielle asked softly, tilting her head. "Please finish that thought for the record." For a heartbeat, his expression faltered. He glanced at her hand, the one still resting in her pocket. For the first time, a flicker of doubt entered his eyes. Was she recording? He didn't know. And that sliver of uncertainty made him angrier. He turned away and shouted, "Search the house! If she resists, arrest her." The 2 officers on the porch resumed their approach. Danielle's heart pounded. Not in panic, but in preparation. She gave no outward signal, no words. Only a small, sharp whistle, just one note, psoon, barely perceptible to human ears, but unmistakable to 2 beings inside the house. The front door creaked open. Ranger and Echo emerged with calculated grace, not barking, not growling, but moving with the silent efficiency of Black Ops soldiers. Their Kevlar vests shimmered under the sunlight, each one marked clearly with Military Working Dog Special Operations Command. Ranger, lean and alert, flanked right. Echo, heavier and built like a freight train, moved forward to shield Danielle. Their movements were too precise to mistake them for pets. The officers froze mid-step. Every man instinctively shifted a hand to his weapon, but none of them drew. Because something in the dog's calm, lethal stillness sent an unmistakable signal. "Don't!" Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Ranger. Echo. Hold position," she said evenly. The dogs stopped, still alert, their gazes locked on the intruders. They would not move unless given cause. The field was suddenly silent, heavy with realization. The illusion of control had shifted. Renshaw looked from the dogs to Danielle, then back again. Confusion spread across his face, then something else, recognition. These weren't ordinary animals. These were federal assets, weapons with fur and teeth built and trained for war, trained by the very woman he thought he could intimidate. And in that moment, for the first time since arriving, Captain Renshaw didn't know what to do next. Danielle stood tall, calm, and centered no longer the one surrounded, but the one holding ground. And the war on her doorstep had just met its first wall. A low rumble echoed down the gravel drive as the wheels of a van kicked up a faint cloud of dust, subtle at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Captain Renshaw turned toward the noise jaw, tightening, as he caught sight of the logo emblazoned on the side Channel 7 News. A white van with a satellite dish on its roof rolled to a stop just beyond the police cruisers. From the passenger door emerged a poised, determined figure with a shoulder-mounted camera already whirring to life. "Good morning," the woman called out, voice clear and crisp. "Lisa Chen, Channel 7. We received an anonymous tip about possible police overreach at a veteran's residence. Can you comment on what's happening here?" Danielle didn't flinch. She had known the clock was ticking the moment her security system triggered its automatic media alert set to activate if more than 3 police vehicles remained on her property for over 15 minutes. It was a safeguard she had implemented after filing her civil complaint. She hadn't expected to need it so soon, but here it was right on cue. Renshaw's face turned a deeper red. "This is an active investigation," he barked, waving his hand dismissively. "You need to leave." But Lisa Chen wasn't moving. "We're on a public access road, Captain," she replied evenly. "We're fully within our rights to document what appears to be a use of force against a decorated military veteran on her own property." She raised the camera slightly and zoomed in on the scene: 6 armed officers, 2 military dogs in defensive formation, and a single black woman standing firm between them all. The optics were damning, and Renshaw knew it. Danielle's posture didn't change, but inside she could feel the subtle shift. This was no longer an isolated standoff. This was public. Witnessed. Recorded. Renshaw took a step toward her, his voice low and cold. "This little stunt with the media isn't going to help you. We're here on legitimate police business." Danielle met his gaze without blinking. "You have no warrant, no probable cause. You've trampled my garden, destroyed my property, and tried to enter my home under false pretenses. All of it has been recorded by my security system, and now by the press. This is not an investigation. It's harassment." Behind her, Echo remained still as stone eyes locked on the officers closest to the porch. Ranger hadn't moved either, but his ears twitched slightly with each voice, each motion calculating the field like a battlefield scout. Then Danielle's phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced down to see the name she had been waiting for: Marcus Gainshire, attorney, and emergency contact. She didn't even have to answer before Renshaw's hand darted forward, snatching the phone and throwing it onto the driveway. The screen shattered on impact. "Oops," he said, smiling with mock concern. "Looks like you've got a broken phone." Danielle didn't react, not with anger, not with fear. Because what Renshaw failed to realize was that everything, every word, every step, every aggression had already been sent to the cloud. Her lawyer had received the footage minutes ago, and now, with cameras rolling and a reporter asking questions, the entire state was about to learn what kind of captain Willow Creek had placed in charge. And for the first time, Renshaw seemed to feel it, the beginning of consequences. Before the dust from Renshaw's tantrum could settle, a new vehicle rolled onto the property. A dark brown SUV, its grille adorned with a red and blue light bar. It didn't flash, didn't scream. It simply arrived with the quiet gravity of someone who didn't need theatrics to assert control. The side read County Sheriff's Department, and the license plate confirmed what Danielle had only hoped: Sheriff Nathan Daniels. A seasoned lawman with 20 years in uniform, Daniels was no stranger to small-town politics, or the kind of systemic rot that often hid behind polished badges. But unlike Renshaw, Daniels had served in the army before his days in law enforcement. He understood hierarchy respect, and he knew Danielle by name. Daniels stepped out of his vehicle, eyes scanning the scene with growing disapproval. He took in the damaged garden, the shattered phone, the 6 officers with their hands near their weapons, and the military dogs still holding position like they were guarding a perimeter in Kandahar. Finally, his gaze landed on Danielle, standing tall and silent, unmoving, unshaken. He nodded once respectfully. "Captain Renshaw," the sheriff called out, voice even, but edged with steel. "Care to explain what's going on here?" Renshaw straightened his posture, but the shift in power was already evident in the way his men subtly stepped back. "Routine investigation, sir," he replied, walking over. "We had reports of suspicious activity. Do you have a warrant?" Daniels cut him off. Glancing down at Renshaw's empty hands, Renshaw hesitated. "Not yet, but with probable cause." "That's not how this works, and you know it," Daniels said sharply. "You can't search a private residence without a warrant or direct evidence of a crime in progress. Neither applies here." Daniels turned to Danielle and removed his wide-brimmed hat. "Ms. Moore," he said, his tone respectful. "I received a call about possible misconduct involving my deputies. I apologize for this intrusion. May I speak with you privately?" Renshaw interjected, desperate to regain control. "Sir, we believe there may be illicit substances on the premises. We were just about to search the shed when what Daniels turned on him, when the media showed up, when 2 federally trained military dogs appeared, or when you realized your intimidation tactics were being live-streamed." The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. Lisa Chen repositioned her camera for a better angle. The officers began to shift nervously. Even Renshaw's most loyal men stepped further away from him. Officer Bennett, standing behind the group, looked visibly relieved. Daniels faced Danielle once more. "Ma'am, I'd like to get a full statement from you and see any footage you've collected. If there's any suggestion of planted evidence or civil rights violations, well, escalate this immediately." Danielle nodded. "You're welcome to review everything. My system's already uploaded footage to my attorney and my dogs." She motioned toward Echo and Ranger are still in a defensive hold. "They'll stand down when I say so." Daniels nodded again. "Good dogs," he said almost under his breath with the admiration of a man who recognized elite training when he saw it. And just like that, the power on that gravel driveway shifted for good, not with a gun drawn or a threat issued, but with the quiet, resolute authority of someone whose badge still meant protection, not fear. As Sheriff Daniels began his private conversation with Danielle near the edge of the porch, a subtle disturbance caught her eye, movement just beyond the shed near the tree line. She shifted her stance slightly, just enough to keep the corner of the structure in view. One of Renshaw's officers, Delaney, if she remembered the name correctly, was loitering there alone, pretending to check the area. But Danielle saw it for what it was, misdirection. The man knelt beside one of her storage containers, quickly pulling something from his vest pocket and sliding it inside. In that moment, everything clicked. They weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were trying to frame her. A manufactured bust to silence her complaint, discredit her reputation, and bury the corruption she dared to expose. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tapped the side of her smartwatch, activating the property's hidden security protocol. Instantly, her encrypted cloud system marked the video for priority upload and sent real-time alerts to her attorney Marcus Gaines and members of the Sentinel Protocol, a network of veterans she'd helped build to quietly watch over one another when official systems failed. Danielle had seen the darkness in her tours overseas, but nothing compared to the quiet malice of abuse cloaked in the American flag. Then came the unmistakable buzz of her phone. This time, a text from Marcus, despite the shattered screen, received alert. "Sentinel Protocol engaged. Hold position. Help en route." Danielle's breath steadied. She glanced at Ranger and Echo, still statues of obedience, and gave a silent hand signal to maintain alert positioning. Behind her, Sheriff Daniels was mid-sentence when he noticed the change in her expression. "Problem?" he asked, voice low. Danielle nodded toward the shed. "One of Renshaw's men just planted evidence. My cameras caught it. The footage is uploading now. They're not just here to harass me, Sheriff. They're trying to erase me." Daniels didn't hesitate. He immediately dispatched Officer Bennett, whose demeanor had turned from hesitant to quietly resolved to secure the shed and preserve the evidence exactly as it was. "Nothing gets touched," he ordered. "Not until the prosecutor arrives." As Bennett moved off, another sound broke the tension, the hum of engines. 2 pickup trucks pulled up along the road, windows tinted, flags mounted discreetly behind the cabs. Out stepped 4 men and women, some in civilian clothes, others in parts of old uniforms, familiar faces from local veteran support groups. They didn't speak. They simply stood at the edge of the property, watching calmly, forming a silent line. Solidarity. Sheriff Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Friends of yours?" Danielle nodded once. "Sentinel Protocol. I helped design it after Marcus Williams was killed by police in Arizona. This is our answer to a system that protects itself instead of the people it swore to serve." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, then nodded in quiet understanding. "Then I'm glad they're here." In that moment, it became clear to everyone present. Renshaw, his nervous deputies, the reporter still filming just outside the fence, that this wasn't going to be another quiet injustice buried by bureaucracy. Danielle Moore wasn't alone. She had brought her own army. The sun dipped low beyond the pine ridge, casting Danielle's property in long golden shadows, but she knew better than to mistake that stillness for peace. The rest of the day passed like the calm before a storm. Deputies from the county secured the shed where the evidence had been planted. Footage had been downloaded, statements taken, and Sheriff Daniels promised full cooperation. Yet Danielle's instincts, honed from years on active duty, told her this wasn't over. Men like Captain Renshaw didn't retreat quietly, especially when cornered. That night, as the last camera crew packed up and the county officials departed, her Sentinel allies remained. They rotated informal watch duty from their trucks parked just beyond the fence line, nodding solemnly to her before each shift. Echo and Ranger paced restlessly inside, attuned to her unspoken tension. Then, at precisely 3 a.m., Sierra's ears twitched. Danielle was already awake. She never slept deeply anymore. She slipped from bed and crouched beside the window, switching her security tablet to night vision mode. Her heart tightened. 5 shadows crept along the property's rear boundary, their movement too practiced, too deliberate to be mere trespassers. They weren't local kids. They were tactically trained, communicating with hand signals, scanning for blind spots between cameras. But Danielle had designed her system for asymmetric warfare, exactly this kind of threat. The cameras didn't just see them. They identified faces. She recognized, too, immediately Delaney, the officer who had planted evidence, and Renshaw himself. They weren't coming to talk. One of them, an unknown man in black fatigues, carried a gasoline canister. They were going to burn at all the house the evidence, and Danielle with it. Her hands moved with the calm precision of a soldier in combat. She activated the sprinkler system remotely, sending jets of water across the property. The would-be arsonists flinched, momentarily disoriented, and that was all Danielle needed. One sharp whistle, the high-pitched signal meant for deployment. Echo and Ranger launched into motion with eerie silence, moving through the shadows like ghosts. Echo flanked wide, circling toward the intruder's rear. Ranger kept low, straight, toward the biggest threat, the one with the gasoline. In the chaos of shifting shadows and surprise, the attackers couldn't react in time. Echo tackled the gas man, bringing him down hard, jaws clamped tight, not to maim but to incapacitate. Renshaw spun around, weapon drawn. Danielle had already taken position behind the porch post, her voice steady as thunder. "Federal agents on the property. Drop your weapon." Floodlights burst to life. Security sirens blared. And from the front of the property, the veterans who had stayed all night surged forward like a silent tide. At that exact moment, Officer Bennett's battered sedan skidded to a halt in the driveway. He stumbled out, blood on his face, shouting loud enough to shake the trees. "They came to my house. They beat me when I refused to recant my statement." Renshaw turned in panic just long enough for Sierra emerging from the shadows to disarm him with surgical precision, her bite locking on his wrist. His pistol falling harmlessly to the wet grass. What had started as intimidation had now escalated to attempted murder and arson, captured on 3 angles of HD security footage witnessed by veterans, a wounded officer, and within minutes arriving state troopers. Danielle didn't gloat. She stood in the porch light, one hand resting calmly on Echo's back, watching as Renshaw was finally taken down, not by force, but by truth strategy, and a network of people who refused to let another injustice pass silently into the dark. By dawn, the gravel driveway to Danielle's farmhouse looked more like a command post than a crime scene. Red and blue lights pulsed steadily in the misty morning air as FBI agents, state investigators, and members of the Department of Defense arrived in unmarked SUVs and military-grade sedans. News vans were already positioned along the county road filming, as the now detained Captain Renshaw and Officer Delaney were loaded into black federal transports in handcuffs. Their night ambush had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. The footage from Danielle's surveillance system, combined with the live testimony of a bloodied Officer Bennett and the eyewitness accounts from multiple veterans, left no room for doubt. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a conspiracy. As forensic investigators secured the shed, they recovered a bag containing methamphetamine fresh, unstained by dust, unlike the surrounding tools. The packaging was pristine, and worse for the conspirators, it was captured on video being placed by Delaney hours earlier. Nearby, Prosecutor Valencia Torres, sharp-eyed and methodical, supervised the evidence tagging. This wasn't just an act of harassment, she stated to Sheriff Daniels. This was a setup, an illegal operation orchestrated to discredit a military veteran and silence her complaint. But that complaint filed 3 weeks earlier was now the thread unraveling a much larger web. As state police swept the perimeter, Chief Wilson Renshaw's cousin and head of the Willow Creek Police Department pulled onto the property with backup. But his arrival was met by firm resistance. "This is now a federal matter," Torres said flatly. "Your department is the subject of investigation. You are to leave the premises immediately." Wilson objected, citing jurisdiction, but was quickly silenced when 2 state troopers and Sheriff Daniels stood beside Torres. Then, with timing that felt almost cinematic, 2 state police cruisers rolled in behind Wilson, boxing in his car like a predator caught in its own trap. Meanwhile, a growing crowd had begun to gather on the edge of the property, neighbors, community members, and other property owners who had once believed their struggles were isolated. But as news spread, more people arrived, many recognizing the pattern minority landowners harassed, intimidated, and forced to sell land near the proposed luxury resort development. These weren't random abuses, they were coordinated efforts to clear land for profit. Inside her home, Danielle met with Marcus Gaines and Agent Michaels from the Department of Defense. "We've confirmed Sentinel Protocol intercepted your emergency call," Michaels said, "and you now have federal protection moving forward. It wasn't just formality, it was a statement the military had taken notice. They would no longer let one of their own be sacrificed to small-town corruption." Outside, the scene transformed from containment to coordination. Veterans in uniform worked side by side with federal agents. Torres ordered a lockdown on all Willow Creek PD case files related to land seizures. Officer Bennett, bruised but unshaken, sat with his infant daughter in his arms and quietly agreed to testify, revealing that Renshaw and Wilson had pressured officers to target minority-owned properties near the resort development. "They called them cleanup operations," he said grimly. The machinery of justice was now fully engaged, and Danielle, still calm, her dogs lying faithfully at her feet, watched as the empire built on intimidation, and lies began to crumble not through force or vengeance, but by truth, courage, and a community that refused to stay silent any longer. As the early morning haze lifted, Danielle stood on her porch, watching as the ripple effects of the takedown echoed far beyond her property line. What had begun as a personal ambush had now triggered a statewide legal earthquake. Hours after Renshaw and Delaney were placed in federal custody, Chief Wilson's office was raided by order of the state attorney general. Internal documents and encrypted messages were confiscated, and within hours, damning evidence surfaced detailing a pattern of illegal property targeting coordinated under the guise of neighborhood stabilization near the Willow Creek Resort Development Project. The documents showed how minority landowners were systematically harassed, surveilled, and falsely cited to pressure them into selling. At the center of it all was a real estate developer, the police chief's own brother-in-law, who had funneled campaign contributions and backdoor payments through shell organizations and the Willow Creek Police Benevolent Fund. The story exploded in the press, news anchors and legal analysts across the country began covering what they were now calling the Sentinel case. Danielle's home became a symbol not just of resilience, but of the reckoning America had long delayed. Reporters replayed the surveillance footage across every major outlet, police planting evidence, officers attacking their own, and military dogs holding the line beside a woman who refused to be intimidated. Hashtags like #stand. With Danielle and justice. For veterans surged on social media. Overnight, Danielle went from rural veteran to national symbol of civil resistance. Inside a secure room near the county courthouse, Officer Bennett gave his full deposition to Prosecutor Torres. His voice cracked only once when describing how Renshaw's men showed up at his home, beat him in front of his wife and newborn, and warned him not to testify. His statement, supported by video evidence from his own home security system, confirmed everything Danielle had said and more. They called it cleansing, he said it would make the area look better for the investors. But what they really meant was erasing people who didn't look like them. As investigators dug deeper, 7 other landowners, all people of color, came forward. Each had been cited, surveilled, or offered well below market rates to sell. 2 had nearly lost their properties through fabricated zoning violations. But now, with the FBI and Department of Justice involved, the House of Cards had collapsed. The planned luxury resort development was immediately placed under federal review, its corporate sponsors scrambling to distance themselves. Danielle never gloated. She spent that evening in her backyard, seated beneath the wide Carolina sky, with Echo resting against her leg and Ranger curled at her feet. Her farmhouse had been saved, but more importantly, the people who had no voice now had a platform. In the distance, her veterans took turns on watch, not because they needed to, but because they chose to. The system hadn't protected Danielle. She had built one of her own, and in doing so, she had reminded the nation that justice doesn't arrive on its own, it must be summoned, protected, and fought for. 6 months later, under a crisp autumn sky, Danielle Moore stood on the wide granite steps of the federal courthouse, a small American flag fluttering at her side, her 2 loyal companions, Echo and Ranger, at perfect attention. What had started as a pre-dawn assault on her home had become something far greater, a national reckoning. Behind her, the building bustled with press, federal agents, and legal teams. In front of her stood a diverse crowd of community members, veterans, journalists, and activists, many of whom had once felt powerless, isolated, or ignored. Now they stood united under one cause: accountability. The federal grand jury had returned its indictments in sweeping fashion. Captain Renshaw, Officer Delaney, and Chief Wilson faced a litany of charges: conspiracy, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. But the investigation didn't stop there. Tracing the flow of money and power, prosecutors uncovered a sophisticated network of real estate developers, political donors, and police department insiders who had worked in tandem to drive minority property owners off valuable land under the guise of urban revitalization. What had seemed like local corruption was in fact part of a statewide pattern replicated in 3 other counties with identical tactics and the same web of silent complicity. Danielle's courage and her refusal to back down sparked more than just indictments. It inspired legislative change. In Washington, D.C., members of Congress introduced the Veterans Justice Act, mandating federal oversight in any case where former service members were involved in local law enforcement disputes, particularly where civil rights violations were alleged. Statewide new rules were passed requiring civilian oversight boards with investigative powers, mandatory body camera use, and public access to property seizure records. And perhaps most importantly, what had once been Danielle's personal emergency measure, the Sentinel Protocol, had now grown into a national nonprofit Veterans for Community Defense. With chapters forming in a dozen states, the organization offered training in legal rights documentation, de-escalation tactics, and surveillance for vulnerable communities. Veterans who once patrolled battlefields overseas now worked hand in hand with citizens to ensure that no one else would face what Danielle had endured alone and unprotected. Even those once silent began to speak. Officer Bennett, now fully recovered and promoted to community liaison officer, stood beside Danielle on the courthouse steps. His testimony had helped seal the case, but it was his ongoing commitment to outreach reform and healing that made him a bridge between the system and the people it was supposed to serve. Danielle took the podium, her voice calm but unshakable. "This victory isn't just about me," she said. "It's about all of us, those who've been silenced, overlooked, and underestimated. What happened in Willow Creek wasn't unique. It was just exposed. The goal now is not vengeance, but transformation." As her words echoed over the plaza, a federal transport van pulled into the loading bay. Inside, Renshaw sat shackled and silent, no longer the man who once barked threats with a hand on his weapon. He caught Danielle's eye through the tinted glass. But there was no hate in her gaze, only clarity. Justice had arrived. And it was built by the very people the system had once tried to crush. As the crowd dispersed and the courthouse plaza slowly emptied, Danielle Moore remained at the top of the steps, Echo and Ranger still at her side, their posture relaxed, but alert as if they too understood the battle wasn't over, only paused. She looked out over the horizon of Willow Creek, a town that once tried to break her, now reshaped by the strength of a woman who refused to be erased. Her once quiet farm had become more than a home. It was now a sanctuary, a training ground for therapy and service dogs, and a resource center for marginalized communities seeking protection and guidance. Where once developers saw profit, now stood purpose. In the months since the verdicts, Danielle had helped 7 other landowners reclaim their rights. Some had filed lawsuits, others had rebuilt, and all had found strength in each other. Veterans for Community Defense now operated with a volunteer legal team, trauma counselors, and community organizers across multiple states. The initiative born from crisis had blossomed into a full-fledged movement, a new kind of defense system rooted not in firepower, but in solidarity and truth. Even Lisa Chen, the journalist who'd shown up that morning with a single camera, had gone on to win a National Investigative Award. Her documentary, The Sentinel Line, became a classroom staple in university ethics and criminal justice programs. Officer Bennett, once a silent observer, now taught de-escalation and bias training to new recruits, using his own story as a warning and a lesson. And Danielle. She kept showing up. Not for recognition, but for duty to remind every neighbor veteran and voiceless citizen that justice begins with someone choosing to stand. Sometimes the systems meant to protect us fail us the most. But justice isn't about waiting for rescue, it's about choosing to resist with courage, clarity, and community. Danielle Moore's story proves that even when the odds feel stacked, one person's truth, backed by preparation, allies, and integrity, can bring entire corrupt structures to their knees. Have you ever witnessed injustice in your own community? Did you speak up or wish you had? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. We want to hear your voice. Comment. Stand with Danielle if you believe in civilian oversight and veteran-led accountability. Like this video if you believe no one should be punished for telling the truth. Subscribe for more powerful, true stories of justice, resilience, and the everyday heroes changing our world. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder. You are never truly alone when you choose to stand for what's right. Thank you for watching, and remember, the shadows fall hardest before the dawn. But justice always walks in the light.